choice, because that chaplain can then embrace and encourage you. It was one of the great sadnesses and irritations of my time when I was in the prison service, that there was an attempt at one point from chaplaincy headquarters to say that if you registered by denomination, they should just be registered as Christian. And you might think that's a lovely ecumenical thing, but it's actually a disaster. Because what you're saying is that the one thing that you've chosen for some reason to pick as your own didn't matter, when it does. If you say you're C of E, it means something. If you say you're Methodist, it means something. If you say you're evangelical, Pentecostalist, Catholic, it means something. As a Catholic, it meant that, number one, you had me at your door, knocking. Always knock on the door. They always knew it was the chaplain, because you knocked at the door and they go, that'll be the chaplain. How do you know? Because only the chaplain knocks at the door. Everybody else just wanders in. You also means that you get invited to chapel. It means you get, when you first met, I would say to them, all right, you're a Catholic, where do you go to school? What's your background? Or my grandma used to say to me, well, actually, it's my mum's that's a Catholic. It would be any number of reasons, and some it'd be practicing. But what it gave you is a chance to say to them, well, however you want to do this, you are invited to come to Bible study. Maybe you may never confirm, you might think about confirmation. You're invited to come to Mass. You're invited to come to different kinds of worship. You're invited to embrace what it means. Now, in a local prison, that might be a short-term thing. But in a long-term prison, with guys looking ahead for years, it creates a new experience. When I tried to understand what my role was as a chaplain, it was a prisoner, a guy called Kevin. No surprise, he was a Catholic, who actually best encapsulated it for me. And he said, it's the you're like the angel who went to see St. Peter in the Acts of the Apostles. And of course, you know where that is in the Acts of the Apostles, don't you, fellas? Oh, of course I do. Give me 5 minutes. We didn't have Google them, but Acts 12:7, I think. I've written it down to make sure. It talks about the angel coming, and there is Peter with no hope. He's no hope. He's in chains. He's in his cell. And then the angel appears. And in the cell, a light shone. And the role of a chaplain in a prison is to bring some light into darkness, to bring something different into life. And the rest of that quote, of course, is the chains fell from his hands. And you, in some way, hope to unchain them. Now, specifically on Lent, which we all know means springtime, I always find it quite frustrating that we approach Lent like we approach going to the dentist, as if it's something we've got to steel ourselves for. We approach Lent as something that's going to be a burden on our lives, something that's going to drag us down. Well, of course, it's not. That's not its purpose. And so when you try and think about Lent, I would start from this point of view. Think about the first Lent. The first Lent, Jesus. And wonderfully, we had Mark's Gospel yesterday, the simplest description after he was baptized. Remember, he's driven into the desert. We talk about dragging ourselves. He's driven into the desert and he's tempted for 40 days. And what doesn't he do? Now, how many of us here have been reminded by our priests or our bishop or anybody else that Lent is about fasting, almsgiving, more prayer? At no point do we hear anything about almsgiving during the story of Jesus. We don't hear that. We don't hear that Jesus gives anything up. We simply hear that he's got nothing to eat and he has nothing to drink. Now, that is a choice because he's offered them. But it's his choice to say no. The first Lent, the Lent that makes our whole lives, it changes our whole lives once a year, is a Lent of a person who is made to go somewhere, driven by the Spirit, but he uses it as a time of preparation. Saint Teresa of Avila, because she was always a cheerful soul, she came out with the famous quote, "Our lives are so short that we should spend more of it preparing for death." Woohoo! But she's right, because Lent, and now this is something I used to say to the guys, because some guys would describe prison, some of the women, and work with the women in high security, would describe prison as a bit of a death sometimes. Lent is about mortification. We misuse that word. We use it to say, "I was mortified, I could have died," or it's some kind of beating ourselves up. No. Mortification truly means preparing yourself for heaven. Preparing ourselves to live a life that guides us to heaven. Jesus, 40 days in the desert, prepared him for his mission to preach and to save, to heal. Now, that's what Lent is for us, and it was for the guys in prison. Now, imagine whatever you've decided to do, what sacrifice you've got. But in preparing for Lent, if you're in prison, giving something up, it's really quite hard, because what few luxuries you have really do have to be earned. And to choose to give them up, there is something of the widow's mite about that. It's not, it might not sound a popular thing to say when you think about prisoners, but it's the truth. Guys in dispersal prisons, which should mean where you're dispersed around the country, they have the right to cook their own food on most of them in the landings and things, in Cat A prisons and things, but they have to be able to earn the money to do it, and they share in what they call a food boat. Somebody this week would order that, somebody'd order that, somebody'd order that, so you'd have this food boat. Now, if you decided as a Catholic that I want to do something for Lent, and you decide it's going to be affected by the food you have, suddenly you're affecting other people. That's a task. And when you're close to with others, and you're suddenly saying, "I'm not doing that anymore. Not for the next 40 odd days, I won't be doing that. I'll be doing this with money instead." You're actually affecting other people's lives. And that's a difficult thing. But lesson one that we can be taught about Lent from prison. It affects if you're doing Lent properly, if I'm doing Lent properly, it affects other people's lives. It should affect other people's lives. It isn't a private matter. It is a life-affirming choice that affects us. Sacrifice in the face of temptation is a story of Lent. There are so many temptations in prison. You have no idea. The films tell you nothing. The programs can't show it to you. The documentaries can never quite get it right. And trust me, the books that even prisoners write, well, let's just say they shine it up a little bit. In prison, the temptations to be involved in groups, to be involved in nefarious matters, to be involved in drug taking, to be involved in violence, to be involved in bullying another person, or just even the temptation to choose to go to the gym rather than choose to go to chapel. And they're not so up against each other, they often are. The temptation to think that actually if I do something for chapel, I might lose out somewhere else. The temptation that even if you don't want to get involved in gangs or fighting, to turn away and not look, not to help another. All these temptations are there. So in Lent, the emphasis for me with fellas would be this. Look at your life. Ask yourself what burdens you're carrying, and ask yourself why you're carrying them during this season of Lent. Jesus did not carry a haversack through the desert. He must put them down. And so let's just think of a day. What does a day go like for a prisoner? You get called up. You might have to go to work. Not at the moment. I don't know how they're surviving at the moment. You might be going to work. You might go into education, or you might, when you've had your breakfast, you might then have to be locked up until for the rest of the afternoon. You might be working a workshop. You might be a cleaner on the wing, you might work in the laundry, you might work in braille shops, you had all these kinds of different things. You might have put yourself down for a chapel group of one kind or another. And we did get them recognised as groups where you could get paid for it as well. So going to something meant you got paid. If you didn't go to them, you don't get paid. If you lose it, you don't get paid. So you get called out. You have to go to you have to be checked. You get searched wherever you go. You're searched. You walk down then to the workshop or education or whatever it is, or you go back to your cell. Then you're told when you have to come back again. You walk down. You're looking around you. You're afraid something might kick off. You're being searched all the time. You have your dinner, you get locked up, you come out again. Everything's regulated. Bells go off, people are called. You get a small amount of time to have your phone calls. You get a smaller amount of time to cook. If you haven't got enough money, you might get food from the kitchens. You have a small amount of time to eat. Everything is restricted. You might get visits. The visits might be called off. You might have made lots of plans. You might have arranged something for a workshop for weeks, and suddenly an emergency shutdown. Security gets involved. Your life is regulated from the outside. So how do you do, when everything's controlled, how do you do Lent? Well, Lent is an internalized affair. Think about this. Lent should not be about, as we're told on Ash Wednesday, making a show. People shouldn't know about Lent. People shouldn't, if they know it's accidentally. Our choices are our choices. If it's something to do with the food bottle or something like that, yeah, it might affect it. But what if you've decided, say, that you want to go to prayer groups once a week or twice a week that are on for Lent? And that means you're going to miss your gym. Now, if you miss a session or to a gym, you lose your gym session. So it's my job as a chaplain to try and arrange that doesn't affect them. But you're making a decision to do something for yourself which isn't something you enjoy in a different way. I'm not saying you won't enjoy what you get. You might come to a meditation, a prayer class, a Bible study, and you choose that is what I'm going to do as part of my Lenten observance. You might choose that together with others, I might decide to pray at a certain time of day. You might choose in a time of Lent that you will put aside, and this can be a difficult one. You will put aside watching the TV. You might give your TV up. You have to pay for your TV, by the way. Not everybody gets a TV. You have to earn the money. Forget all the rubbish. You might say, "I'm giving up my television for Lent." You can't really do that in a shared cell, but you can in single cells. You might have to physically give something up, and then have to sit on your own in your cell. What do you do? How do you fill the time? Well, my job as chaplain was to try and get to people to understand that the best thing you can do in the time of Lent is look at yourself and ask yourselves what the question I asked before: what burdens am I carrying? Now, be honest about this. Lent is not a time for counselling. There's enough counselling going on around guys all the time. It's not, whilst it is certainly a time to self-examine, and it's certainly a time to test your stamina, perhaps, and your boundaries, it isn't a time of dieting. It's not a time of trying to impose a different discipline on other people. It's a time for us to ask ourselves, or them to ask themselves, what am I avoiding in my life? What is it I've not chosen to look at? What is it that gets between me and heaven? I'm not talking about the crimes specifically or anything like that. What do I do in my life that prevents me getting to heaven? What temptations come my way and I just give in to them? What do I do that does not help me? If you think about it, going back to my concept of Jesus' Lent, Jesus carried nothing with him, and yet he was still assailed. Now, if you are a person who has lots of time on your own, as a lot of prisoners do in long-term prisons, or if you're in a shared cell, different matter, but you've got a lot of time on your own, you've got a lot of time to reflect, the danger is that it becomes a time of redundancy, a time of giving up. And actually, it should be a time of building. So what we did, he made a choice. As guy, I'd asked the fellas what they'd like, or the women when I worked with the women. What would you like to do for Lent? How would you like to fill the time? What would you like to do? And the one thing that came up, because they were prisoners, was we'd like to pick a time of our own when we do something ourselves. Now, at the moment, we're told we can't go here and we can't go there, we can't do this, we can't do that. Now, for prisoners, time was everything. If you're a guy inside a prison, what time do I have to myself? What time? And what can I do with that time? So one year, one of the guys said, I'd like to learn the rosary, Father. Okay. And then I'd like us all to pray the rosary at 6 o'clock, because you used to get locked up at 5:30 with the teas. And I'd like us to say the rosary at 6 o'clock every night. I said, okay, I'll say the rosary at 6 o'clock every night as well. And we remind each other when it's supposed to be. And I know that guys would say to each other, shout across the landings and things, have you started the rosary yet, Billy? Or Clark, have you got the rosary? Which mystery are you on? Things like that. But I tell you something that was amazing. Because guys would talk about, because I would say, because I used to run meditation classes, and Ignatian style meditation, and which was a great way to help, because that's another thing I'd say to you. We're surrounded by noise in our lives. The worst thing we can do is try to ignore it, because it'll never work. The great thing about meditation, Ignatian style of meditation, is you embrace the noise, acknowledge it, and let it go. Don't let it bother you. And I'd teach the guys this style, and I'd teach them to try and pray the rosary in that way, with a mystery in that way, to live the mystery, to breathe it, to hear the sounds, to smell the scents, and try and live it that way. It'd be a wonderful experience that he'd talk about. But one day, a prison officer said to me, Father Jed, have you got a minute? I said, yeah. I said, what is it? He said, when I was walking down the landing the other day, I heard one of the guys shouting across, which mystery is it? Which mystery is it? And the other guy responded, and I could hear them praying, not loudly, not making a show. He said, Father, I've not said the rosary in years. And it really affected me. I mean, these are guys who would possibly get into fights with him coming any other time. He said, but it really affected me. It touched my heart. Maybe he didn't say it with that accent, but you know what I mean. And it was a reminder that Lent, our Lent, should affect others. I talked about how Lent, at the moment, we're in a time of turmoil, aren't we? Let's be honest. We don't know what's going on. The Prime Minister's announced all sorts of things today, and we seem to have a light at the end of the tunnel. But we're in turmoil. Some people are scared of leaving the house. Some people are worried about going near anything. People are scared of going to school. We have a turmoil. There's a great writer called Carlo Coretto, deceased now. He was a religious brother and had been a hermit for a long time. And he used to talk about quiet amidst turmoil. I'll just share a little story with you. Every so often things would kick off in prison. Oh, Lordy, they'd kick off. Big time. Fights that explode between different gangs and groups, and there's something building up. And there's one invariable thing that you'd see. They told you how food is so important. They have to save up for the food and do everything for the food. They're preparing their own food. Whenever anything kicked off, you'd see the whole battle. And I might be there when it kicked off, or you might watch it on the CCTV cameras later, and you see people knocking each other about. But then you'd see fellas running from the pads, from the cells, legging it down the sides, getting out of the way of the fight, going in the kitchen, coming out of the kitchen and carrying the food. I remember seeing one where a bloke, you actually see him on camera, because somebody kept moving his pants, and he belts his fella, And the fella knocked right out, bangs down on top of the cooker. Officers come running in. And as the officers are controlling everything, this bloke walks in, reaches the salamander grill over the top, takes the salamander grill off, takes his food off, and runs in. Now, that kind of ability to keep calm and get what you need in the middle of a flaming riot, in the middle of trouble, now that's the kind of quiet and the kind of certainty and the kind of choice we can make during Lent. And I used to use that example with the fellas because they knew it happened because they did it themselves. In the midst of turmoil, in the midst of not knowing what's happening with your family, in the midst of what's not happening in the world, prisoners would try and find a quiet. Charles de Foucault, after whom Carlo Coretto took his guidance, I'm just going to read this one. He must, my time of life. I don't want to get this wrong. He came to identify that Jesus' own efforts gave a new kind of fruitfulness. Because Jesus, in Lent and in his life, chose poverty, utter lowliness, humiliation, rejection, persecution, and suffering. Now, in their ways, men and women in prison, by their choice, maybe, by their actions, they too lived that utter rejection, fear, lack of knowledge of what goes on beyond, heartfelt guilt, so many things. And Lent, by prayer, by reflection, gave them a chance to look at who they've been and imagine who they're going to be. Gave them a chance to overcome all their fears and all of their burdens. What is the point, ladies and gentlemen, or as my old parish priest used to say, and I'm getting old now, my dear children, what is the point of entering Lent with a bag on your back and leaving it with a bag and 2 suitcases? What is the point of entering prison and coming out with no hope of doing anything but going back in again? What is the point? What would the point be of going into a lockdown that we were not going to change it wasn't going to change our lives? If Lent does not change your life, if Lent does not prepare you for heaven, what's the point of Lent? We can't control it. We can't manage it. We can't box it in. It's a season. We've no more hope of boxing in Lent than we have of stopping a mole digging up your garden successfully, or stopping bluebells growing everywhere when you don't want them to. It doesn't happen. We have to have an enduring perseverance. We've got to be. One of the things that guys in prison learnt to do, we had a retreat one year, which was based upon the letters of Carlo Coretto. And one of them are called Desert in the City, where you found a way each day to center and quieten yourself so that whatever was around you could not disturb you, could not overwhelm you. It didn't matter that you were locked up with no way of opening your cell door. It did not matter that there was noises of guys around you. It did not matter that there were threats and shouts and people looking in the window. It did not matter. It enabled you to deal with your worries, your fears, and your sense of rejection. I always found Lent overwhelming, staggering in prison. Because you'd have some guys who'd muck about, but then again, don't we all? You'd have some people who give up halfway through. You'd even have guys who would laugh at me when I told them I was embarrassed how much I'd saved when I'd given up alcohol one year. And when I told them how much it was, but we spent that in a weekend, Father, when we were out. But all kinds of things would happen. People would get up and get down. Some would come to mess around a bit in the group. But, by the end of the Lenten talks, those who messed around didn't mess around anymore. By the end of the process, those who started the rosary continued with the rosary as part of their daily life. One of them said, it would be like trying to not breathe anymore, Father. People who never prayed started to pray. And another thing, because of course I was in the service in one of the prisons for 9 years, and some of these guys I'd seen from other prisons. If they knew they were going to be in a food boat or something, and Lent was coming up, they actually started creating food boats which revolved around guys for Lent. And they would leave the group that they were in, and the other guys would say, "Oh, are you doing Lent this year? Right, well, we'll swap you for 6 weeks." People would start supporting them in it. And people stopped taking the mickey off them. There's nowhere more macho, more aggressive, more judgmental than a prison. Women's prison or men's prison. When it becomes accepted that people will use 6 weeks of their lives doing their best to find more out about themselves and making themselves better people, then you have achieved something. What you've achieved is freedom. A freedom to be yourself. A freedom to be the Christian you wish to be. Not perfect, but giving it a go. They got that freedom. They got that chance. Prisoners really did, as I said before, when they had to give up something, by gum, that was a widow's mite. It was giving up a lot when you had very little. Choice of Lent, whatever you've chosen, maybe you'll change it. Who knows? Don't let it be an imposition. Don't let it be a burden. Don't let it be a horror. If giving something up or doing something extra is a pain, don't do it. Just don't do it. It don't matter. Don't give up chocolate if it's going to be a problem. Don't give up booze if it's got on your nerves. Mind you, Father, Sunday yesterday and a feast day today. Who knows? But there's enough breaks if you need them. But if it's going to be something that's such a pain, then you're not free. What I discovered all those years in prison, I'd go back to work with them tomorrow. What I discovered is that faith gave freedom, and Lent unshackled the guys from every day. If you can do that in a high security prison, you can do it anywhere. I'm coming to the end of this bit now, but I realised I should have said a prayer at the beginning, but I was so late getting on that I didn't. But what I'm going to do is a couple of things I just want to take us to. I did mention at the beginning about St. Therese, who could be a right cheerful soul. I mean, I used to quote her when guys were feeling down in prison, they get upset. Why did God allow this? I remember the famous quote of Teresa of Avila when her wheels came off a wagon in the middle of a stream. And she looked at heaven and she said, "Is it any wonder you've got no friends when you treat your only ones like this?" It can feel a bit like that. But there's a quote. Give me a second. Oh, there we go. Christ has no body now but your body. He has no hands and no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes through which Christ looks compassion into the world. Yours are the eyes through which he looks compassion into the world, with which Christ walks to do good at your feet. Yours are the hands through which Christ blesses the world. Be you in a prison, in a cell, to the day you die or for 30 years, be you not able to go out because you're shielding, be you not able to hug the person you love, to see your grandchildren or your grandma, if you can't go to work or can't do the things you want to do, you are still free. Because you, by your actions and all that you do are Christ. And when it gets hard, I'd urge you this prayer that comes from Charles de Foucault. A prayer I say most days, you say it every day. Father, I abandon myself into your hands. Do with me what you will. Whatever you may do, I thank you. I'm ready for all. I accept all. That only your will be done in me and in all your creatures. I wish no more than this. O Lord, into your hands I commend my soul. I offer it to you with all the love of my heart, for I love you, Lord. So need to give myself, to surrender myself into your hands without reserve and with boundless confidence, for you are my Father. That was a prayer I'd hand out to guys, and you'd find it by the bedsides and on the walls. Abandon yourself to Jesus, and you are free. I'm sorry for my meandering. Father, I hand myself back to your industrious care.